Good. Could you start by introducing yourself and your connection to the Vietnam War?
Okay.
And if you want to do some of your slides first, and if you guys have questions, yes?
Yep.
Good. Excellent.
And can we turn the lights down a little? And
Yeah.
you might want to move closer to see the pictures because of the configuration of the screen.
You guys are welcome to sit here too.
I'm George Payne. As Mr. Fuller said, I had two boys who went here, got out in '95 and 2001, and they're both employed with health care benefits now, I'm pleased to say, so they're out of the house. I am a creature of the 60s. I got out of high school in '63, Sewanee in '67. I went to BGA, and I then was in law school, and I was drafted out. As you know, the draft was a big deal back then. Everybody had to sign up, and you were subject to it. I mean, a lot of people got drafted. I was in my first year of law school and got drafted. I never imagined I would go to Vietnam because I thought I was smarter than the Army and could get out of it. But I found out being smart was irrelevant. The Army has you, and they do with you what they want. So I went to basic training for 2 months in New Jersey. I then went to advanced combat engineering training in Missouri, and I signed up for OCS to stay out of Vietnam for an extra 6 to 10 months. And they ended up sending me to Fort Benning to infantry OCS. I also went through jump school down there. And after 6 months as a training officer, also at Fort Benning, I was off to Vietnam. So I really didn't think I'd end up in combat, but I ended up in combat. And the map right there shows Vietnam. Just to put it in perspective, I was about midway up in something called LZ Betty, which was a base camp in 2 Corps. And I was with a mechanized infantry group. I had a platoon which involved having maybe 30 to 40 guys. The platoon there were 4 platoons in a company. There were 4 companies in a battalion, and I was with the 1st, the 50th Mechanized Infantry Battalion. Why don't we just, and up north was kind of scrub jungles and more open terrain. As you come down, you get into the Central Highlands. I was on the coast, so I worked rice paddies and scrub jungle and did convoys on Highway 1, guarded them, and then after about 4 or 5 months of my 7.5-month experience over there, we went up into the Central Highlands. We got off our APCs and became what we call straight leg infantry. If you were down south, you were in the Mekong Delta, which was lots of water, canals, very, very flat rubber plantations. So your experience was totally different depending on what service you were in, where you were stationed, when you were there, and almost everybody who's been to Vietnam has a different view of Vietnam depending on where they were and who they were and what they did. 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam and 58,000 were killed, which is a stunning figure. 365,000 were wounded. Of the North and South Vietnamese, 2 million people were killed. Another stunning figure. And it was the longest war we had in history. Afghanistan is about to meet that same timeline. It's interesting, about 2,000 people were killed from Tennessee, which is probably about the number that was killed in Afghanistan during the entire war. So it was a pretty bloody affair. Go to the next one. This was our base camp. We had a landing strip, and we could land small planes, and there was an aviation unit of helicopters there, a group of the 101st, the 11th Armored Cav, and our mechanized infantry group. And each of our platoons, that's a company group, and each of the tents held a platoon, and that's where we would go for about 3 or 4 days of the month when we would come back from working in the field, the boonies as we called them. So that's where we'd go to rest, to resupply, and retrain if needed. Next one. And that's our base camp from the air, which is over in that area. It's the only one I have of it. And you can see that's from a helicopter. We were probably doing a recon before we went out on a mission. And the helicopters would just have a machine gun on either side. And this, if you look at the military of today and the war experience of today, they're much more sophisticated than we were. They're better educated. They're better equipped. So it's just a different army than the one I served in. Next one. We're on our APCs getting ready to leave the base camp to go through a city to go out to the areas we worked in, which were free fire zones, which meant we had taken everybody that lived there out of there, relocated them, which was not a smart thing to do politically or militarily. And it meant we could shoot anybody we found out there, or we could interact with them. Next one. That's the main highway, Highway 1, where we would sometimes run convoys. You can see right there where a landmine had gone off under a tank, and so we had stopped for some reason. We probably spent the night in that area, but it was a great view of the city. We rode around on top of our armored personnel carriers, because if a landmine went off underneath, it would blow through the metal flooring and kill everybody in there. So if we were on top, it would just blow us off. And we usually thought that was pretty funny. You'd have ringing in your ears, but things are funny in context. They wouldn't be funny now, but they were funny when we were blown off. Next one. Yeah.
You might have already said this, but how old were you at the time?
It was interesting. In my platoon, I was the oldest guy at 23. Most of them were 18 and 19. You'll see a picture of how young they were. 50% non-high school graduate, one other college graduate, 10% black, 15% Hispanic. Everybody seemed to have one Navajo. I had one Navajo who spoke, barely spoke English, Johnny Begay. And we had 2 guys who were given their choice of jail or the Army, and that was fairly commonplace. If you were arrested, went before a judge, the judge would say, do you want to join the Army, because they needed people. And both of them really regretted having made the choice to go into the Army when they could be safe and sound getting 3 hots in a cot in the States. So next one. That's during Highway 1 during dry season. I was there 5 months. Dry season, it's incredibly dusty, as you can see, and a month and a half monsoon. It's incredibly wet. It rains torrentially every day, and you learn to just deal with it. You can sleep in puddles because, you're just so tired after a long day. It doesn't matter where you sleep if you get some sleep. Next one. That's the main railroad tracks of Vietnam, and we were not allowed to go over them with our armored personnel carriers, our APCs, which of course we did because it was the quickest way to get where we were going. We oftentimes disregarded a lot of rules and regulations. And one of the reasons I like this is you can see the writing on the front of the APC. It says, "You know it ain't easy." And they had these guys were pretty stupid. It spelled no, N-O. So, they had just, some non-high school graduate had been in charge of spelling that day. Next one. And this is when we were on the South China Sea. We had stopped to swim. We were running a convoy of people who didn't see combat, and only 15% of the people who went saw combat. The rest were in support in very safe positions, quite frankly. And so we call them REMFs, and that was a rear echelon MF. And it was just an acronym we all used. It was nothing pejorative about it. You were either a combat guy or you were a REMF. And we had a bunch of REMFs on the convoy, so we told them it was a really dangerous situation. We left them on the road and we went swimming, but we knew we were protected because it was wide open between the mountains and the sea. So, you know, that was just a great picture. And as I mentioned earlier, we had I didn't realize this till later because it was just commonplace back then, but one of the APCs has a Confederate flag on it. And I just, you know, I saw it and I thought, damn, you know, I didn't even think about that when I was there because the Southerners did that. And we didn't have any racial problems out in the field. We did have racial problems which reflected the country in 68, 69, 70, you know, when we were having some pretty violent civil rights issues. So there were problems at the base camp. There weren't when we were out in combat because everybody was literally a brother, and you were bound together by staying alive and wanting to go home. Next one. That's an artillery base. We got support from artillery, and you know, we liked the artillery. We felt it was very safe in the base camp. They liked us coming in because they thought they had additional infantry to protect them. Next one. That's another view of the base camp. It's obviously dry season because you can see the terrain, how dry it is. Next one. That's a 155 cannon. It throws a projectile about 5 miles. And you know, it was a deafening thing, but we preferred to use smaller artillery because we could get them closer to where we were if we needed them. Next one. That's looking down on rice paddies during the dry season. The next one, that's rice paddies during monsoon. They're full of water, and it was the difference in night and day. It was almost like two different experiences. Next one, again, the rice is grown. That's another view. Once the rice is growing, it's very lush. It's very lush in the scrub area, and it's also very lush up in the Central Highlands when you're working the jungles up there. Next one. That's the rice paddies during harvesting season. I think, or it might be planting season, but you can see some people in cone hats who are planting rice as they've done for hundreds of years, just sticking it in manually. Next one. That's the same area where the artillery base was during monsoon. All of a sudden it's emerald green. Next one. That's the clouds rolling in. We were actually walking at this point, not on APCs. And you just see the clouds roll in, and they just roll in and just start raining, and you dealt with it. Next one. That's some people eating in the rain. You just put your poncho on, you just deal with it. And they're sitting on an anthill. And we were probably set up in an ambush at this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you ever have any problems with like keeping your feet dry and like infection or anything like that?
Yeah, we tried as often as possible to change socks to keep our feet dry because you'd get jungle foot, and it was really bad. And I was the one responsible for making sure they clean their socks. But you do it, and I have a picture, and I do the next one. See if. No, go back and one of these pictures like that, the guy has his shoes off and is trying to dry his feet out because it was really important that you stay dry. Next one. Those are two Vietnamese scouts. They were communist, whatever a communist was over there. They've turned themselves in. They're now working for us, and they could see and hear things long before we could because their senses were so finely tuned. And as I told the earlier class, when we were walking and the lead, Kit Carson, the scout, would stop and say, VC up ahead, we couldn't see him. We'd all get what we called a tight asshole because we knew some bad stuff was getting ready to happen. So we loved having them, and they worked well with us. Next one. That's the Central Highlands during the dry season. You can see how tall the mountains are, and it was a long slog going up and down them. Next one. That's I think could be during rainy season in the Central Highlands. Next one. That's dry season in the Central Highlands. Next one. That's we had cut out a landing zone. Some scouts would do it for us when we went in. We'd use it as a base up in the mountains, and then we would leave from it, and that would be the end of it. Next one. That was in a path in the highlands during dry season. You hated using the paths because it was dangerous and you could be ambushed, but if you had to go quickly from point A to point B, you took a path. Go ahead. That's just jungle. Go ahead. Jungle. That's my platoon outside the artillery base during dry season, and you can see the scrub jungle in back. Dry season. Next. That's the APC I drove, and you'll see in the next picture how young a couple of these guys were, and that's me right there with above the driver. Next one. That's just an ambush patrol that we would send out people to kind of guard the approaches to wherever we set up at night before we shut down at night. Next one.
And you're the second from the left, correct?
That's me, yeah, second from the left. And I wasn't supposed to go out on an ambush patrol, but because I needed to be there in the perimeter if something happened. But I hadn't been on one, and I needed to know what it was. So, you know, I didn't like it, you know, because if you get attacked, you have to you have to carry everything you throw out against the enemy. So that's the reason everybody's so loaded down with machine gun bullets, 2 machine guns, two radios in case one gets knocked out. Next one. We're just stuck in the mud. We're happy because we get to stop and not be involved in the war. Next one. Those are 2 guys who were on my APC. Look how young they were. That shorty on the right-hand side, he was probably 18 or 19. And when he got back, because he had made a bunch of money in Vietnam, we didn't pay taxes, he bought one of these high-powered cars and literally killed himself in a car wreck within 5 months, 6 months of getting back. Next one. That was my favorite guy. That was Killer Krosniak. And he always wore a peace sign, which drove the colonel crazy when we'd go back to base camp. And he was known as Killer, and he was the biggest peacenik in the group. He was known as Killer because in an action he got up with a machine gun, a la who's John Wayne, and started shooting the machine gun. Next one. That's another picture of me and Killer up behind me. He was always giving the peace sign. Everybody smoked. We got cigarettes with our C rations. Next one. That's me trying to figure out where we were. We didn't have GPSs, so the way you found out where you were, and you were constantly trying to figure that out. Each of the platoon leaders and platoon sergeants carried a map and a lensatic compass, which is just a regular compass. Okay. That we did that, and you had to know where you were all the time in order to call in artillery strikes, to get in medevacs when people were hurt, to know where the other platoons or companies knew where you were so they wouldn't shoot you, if you walked into their ambush. Next one. This is about all I have from Vietnam too. And the other side would hide rice out in the field, and that was in a cored out anthill. Next one. That was a 22-foot snake we killed one day in the Central Highlands.
How'd you kill that?
What?
How'd you kill it?
Well, I was in the middle. When we were in moving, I was always in the middle of the group. And so the point guy, the word came back down that he had seen a snake and wanted to shoot it. And we hadn't seen anything for a while, so I said this will be a good break for the guys. And I said, yeah, go ahead and shoot it. I imagined one shot, and all of a sudden I heard this guy who had his rifle on automatic, which we call rock and roll, and I heard this, and I, immediately sent word, what the hell's going on up there? and it came back, can I kill him now? And so it was not a happy snake. So we shot it, and as I said, we hadn't seen anything in a while. It was a good break. And so we stopped, and everybody took pictures with it. The guys wanted to skin it so they could put it on their headband, which it stunk after one day, which was the end of their headbands. But next picture. There I am with the steak. It was a big mother. But it was an interesting thing. And so the pictures were taken when it was times of boredom. It was a majority time was of boredom. There were times you were really scared, and there were times you were just terror stricken. So these are the pictures you're seeing are the boredom period. Next one. That was a deer we saw one day. Everybody unloaded on it. Next one. And there we are cooking the deer at our night defensive position. Next one. That was just a lizard my RTO grabbed one day. Next one. That was a centipede that they got. They used to have scorpions that were about this big that everybody was terrified of. And I actually had a guy one night who thought he was bit by a scorpion. We had to medevac him because he went into shock, and he stopped breathing in the helicopter medevac going back to the base camp, and he hadn't even been bit. He was just punched by a stick, but he was so afraid of the scorpion. It just freaked him out. Next one. Those are some fish. Occasionally would come to ponds, would have hand grenades, concussion grenades in the pond, get the fish and cook them. Next one. There we are cooking it in a pot. Next one. That's a hand grenade. That's probably what wounded me. A Chinese communist hand grenade, which we called a Chi-Com. It's the lower thing. The thing above is plastic explosive, because when we found these, we'd put plastic explosive next to them, put a detonation cord in it, and blow it up. Next one. That is a bigger booby trap, as we call them now. They're IEDs, which was a artillery shell, a 105 artillery shell, which if we had moved that bamboo stick, it would have pulled the pin out of the firing pin in the thing and killed everybody within about 30 meters. And we hated these things.
How often did you see stuff like that?
Very rarely where I was. But we found the smaller booby traps all the time, and there were different types of booby traps. A lot of them are meant to wound people because that stops everything, as opposed to killing them. And if you have to stop, you can't go toward someone, and you have to call in medevacs and stuff like that. So oftentimes the purpose of the smaller booby traps was to scare and stop people.
Was it usually just a hand grenade, like a hidden hand grenade somewhere that you found? Like, what was the most common?
The hand grenade, the booby trap, you also had punchy stakes, which were sharpened bamboo that they put excrement on, which would infect any wound that you got. And there were toe poppers where they just take a piece of bamboo, put a nail in the bottom, and drop a bullet in, and just put it on the path. So if you stepped on it, it'd put pressure on the bullet and it'd go through your foot. They had these big things that would come down out of trees with sharpened bamboo stakes on and just impale you. And those were really...
Those in Green Berets. That happened to one of the officers. It's not the one who's adopting Hamchuck, but it's one of the other officers is killed that way.
Yeah. Oh no, that would kill a person, but it also is very demoralizing too. I mean, they had very simplified booby traps. We had claymore mines and things like that, which were a little rectangular thing, plastic explosive, BBs all in the front that would wipe out anyone within 50 meters. And we would blow them with an electrical detonating device. Yeah.
Was it covered up with dirt when you found it?
What's that?
Was it covered up with dirt when you
Oh yeah, yeah. And you have to be really careful. And for some reason, we didn't like the way this looked. And that's the reason someone said, let's check this out. Next one. That's just a Chinook, which is now the tactical aircraft of Afghanistan. Back then it was like a dump truck. Go ahead. That's a flying crane. Next one. There we are in the Central Highlands waiting to go back to base camp for for stand down, next one. That's a smoke grenade that showed helicopters where we were, who we were, the air directions so they'd know how to come in with their helicopter. Next one. This is when we're going back. I was always on the second helicopter because I needed to be there if something happened. If the first one went down, I was always on the last one going out. So that was the bad thing about it being a platoon leader. So I got to take pictures when we were going back to stand down. Next one. Here it is. You know, it just lands and everybody jumps on. You're hanging out of it. No safety, no seat belts. Next one. And there are some guys getting on one. Next one. And there they are just hanging out, happy to be going back to base camp. Safety. Next one. Going out. I think I was coming back from R&R or something at that point. Next one. Okay. Questions? Yeah.
Did you ever have any experiences with embedded reporters or journalists?
About what?
Embedded reporters or journalists?
No. I think there was one on my medevac that wrote up when I was taken out. But it was a story. I mean, journalists were harmless to us. And by the time I was there, it was almost always all draftees in 68, 69 in the Army. And everybody was opposed to the war. I mean, so. But they were great soldiers. I mean, they did everything I told them to do. Even though they opposed the war, they were draftees, they were not educated. They were really, really good soldiers.
Other questions? No, you got it.
I mean, it's interesting. If we had known what I know now, or if the politicians that had studied history and politics of the region, they would have never gone in. I mean, I find it almost criminal what our politicians did and their ignorance of the area. And the French kind of hoodooed us into taking over their role over there. We were basically outsiders involved in an internal situation, as were the French.
Did you feel that way when you were deployed?
And we did. All we cared about is coming home. I mean, it was apolitical. It was day-to-day existence. You know, people would keep, you know, their calendar on their uniform, days they had left, because the odd thing about the war, you didn't go as a group. You went individually, and you were just dropped in. So all of a sudden, you became the new guy. And the new guy, the acronym for the new guy was the FNG, FN new guy. You know, that. So, and that was, again, not pejorative. You know, someone would say, "Who are you?" And I'm the FNG. And you would tell the FNG because they had bright green fatigues on. We all had very faded fatigues. But I was the FNG at one point. And you would stay there. If you lived for 365 days, you went home. And it didn't matter how much the platoon needed you or how bad the situation was, you just got up and left. And some people went straight from that situation. A week later, they were at home. And I think that caused some problems with post-traumatic stress and things like that. I was lucky because I was older. You know, I spent 2 months in a hospital in Japan, so this gave me a chance to decompress. I compartmentalized, and the only time it ever bothered me was when I was in Japan. And it scared me. I had nightmares about what I done wrong, and not put out proper security, and I risked my guys when I unnecessarily. But you kind of let down your guard when nothing is going on, and that's the problem. You have to be vigilant all the time, and that's very, very hard. Yeah?
Did you have any idea what you were getting into going over there? Or did you just kind of...
It's all on-the-job training. It's amazing. You never think you'll end up over there, and when you do, you just go into survival mode. At least that was my experience, and I think everyone I know who went over there, that was their experience.
So were you like new to everything that was going on? Like you were just kind of dropped in there?
You kind of, the Army is very good at acclimating you to the Army. And so you're kind of Army when you go over there. But I also went to OCS where I learned map reading, tactics, booby traps, how to do combat assault, which are helicopter operations, stuff like that. So you're trained to do it. You always wonder, can I do it? It's not that hard because people learn how to survive. We had some bad officers, like happened at My Lai. That guy should have never been an officer. But back then, they were so desperate for people, they were making high school graduates commissioned officers. But Lieutenant Calley should have never been a lieutenant. Yeah.
How long did it take you from becoming an F&G to the platoon leader?
That's a great question. You're scared to death. I mean, I don't care who you are, because all these guys have been through it, they've bonded already, and you're now telling them what to do, who's going to run point, who's going to go out on ambush. It happens pretty quickly because you realize they can't read a map. They don't know what the big picture is. They don't know where they are, where they're going. So if you're at all competent, you can gain their trust pretty quick. But it takes, I was terrified that, they'd tell me to piss off or something. What do I do now? But I think everybody is like that, who goes into that situation. They better be. It's like 7th grade at MBA. Everybody's scared to death. You don't know anyone. You think it's going to be really hard, but then you just kind of lapse into the routine.
Could you mention in the first period about what kind of leader you're going to be?
Oh yeah, and that's one of the things you learn. You can learn leadership. It's real interesting. I had never thought of myself as a leader, and at Fort Benning they teach you can be either an authoritarian leader, General Patton, or you can be a persuasive leader, and I was a persuasive leader, and it's easy to do. It's surprising how easy it is, and the crazy thing is, if you were good and competent, you had to stay out in the field and risk your life and limb. If you were incompetent, they took you out of the field and you got a good job at base camp. So you're thinking, wait a minute, if I was incompetent, I'd be running a PX back at the base camp. I mean, it's all kind of counterintuitive.
What did you think about media coverage of the war when you went back home? And did you think it was an accurate depiction of what you had experienced?
I wonder if anybody really had an active, really knew what was happening. The generals sure didn't. They had these bogus body counts and things like that. The coverage was pretty fair, and everybody saw it through their own lens. I understood why the blacks weren't out of the field. As Muhammad Ali, I mentioned this earlier, said no North Vietnamese ever called me the N-word.